How's it going, everybody? In this video, I'm going to be showing you a budget discard deck tech. We're going to be using Tourach as our commander. He's a 2-mana 2/1 that whenever an opponent discards a card, we're going to put a counter on this. We can also kick it for 2 extra mana and make our opponent discard 2 cards at random. We're going to be making our opponents discard a lot of cards in this deck, so this card can get pretty large. As a quick summary of this deck, we're going to want to deprive our opponent's hands of resources. We have cards in our deck that punish our opponents for having no cards in their hand. It's going to deal them some damage. The creatures that we run in this deck also act as removal, so I kind of consider them as 2-for-1 creatures because they do 2 things. We do play a lot of removal to help control and remove things from the board. Starting off with some planeswalkers, if Davriel is on the field, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, it's going to deal some damage to them. We can also make our opponent discard some cards. Liliana, Waker of the Dead's plus ability is going to make our opponent discard a card. We can also destroy some creatures with her negative ability, and if we do end up ulting her, she's going to bring some things back from the graveyard. Obnixis will help us draw some cards and destroy some creatures, and the ult can help us draw some extra cards too if we end up getting it off. Liliana's Death Majesty is going to help us create some blockers as well as mill cards into our graveyard. Then we can return cards from our graveyard to the battlefield, and her ult allows us to board wipe. When any of these cards deal combat damage to a player, they're going to make our opponent discard. What's nice about them is they either have menace or flying. We can also eternalize the Dream Stealer, so if it is in the graveyard, we can get some benefit out of that. When the Gearhulk and Chupacabra enter the battlefield, they're going to destroy a target creature. The Gearhulk's also going to allow us to gain some life. Massacre Girl is awesome because it has the potential to board wipe or destroy a lot of creatures. Also, a 4/4 with menace is quite good. Big Game Hunter has a madness cost, so if we do discard this card, we can get some easy value out of it. When it does enter the battlefield, we can also destroy a bigger creature. Deathbringer Regent has the ability to destroy every creature on the battlefield. It does cost a lot of mana, but it could come in handy. And Playcrafter is going to force our opponent to either sacrifice or discard a card. The Rat's going to make each opponent discard when it enters the battlefield. And we can continually tap Nezumine Shortfang to make our opponent discard. If that opponent has no cards in their hand, we can flip this card over and it's going to be a 3/3 and it's going to continually deal damage to them as long as they have 3 or fewer cards in their hand. The last creature is pretty awesome because at the beginning of your upkeep, each player discards a card. Whenever Fell Spectre enters the battlefield, we're going to force our opponent to discard. Kind of similar with the other card. Every time an opponent discards a card, we're going to gain 3 life. And every time an opponent's creature dies, we're going to gain some life too. Next up are 3 cheap 1-mana discard spells. Each have their own benefits, but they're nice and cheap to use early in the game. Delirium Skeins is going to make each player discard 3 cards. That includes us. Mind Rate can be casted for 2 mana to make us and our opponent discard a card. And with Distress, we can see our opponent's hand and choose a card from it and make him discard. Eldest Born is a little expensive enchantment, but it's going to force our opponent to sacrifice creatures and planeswalkers, discard cards, and then we can steal one of their creatures or planeswalkers and put onto the battlefield under our control. A lot of value in 1 card. Bottomless Pit's nice because for 3 mana during each player's upkeep, they're going to discard 1 card, and it's at random, which makes it fun. Whenever an opponent discards a card, Megrim is going to deal 2 damage to that player. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if they have 1 or fewer cards in their hand, Shrieking Affliction is going to deal 3 damage to that player. And whenever an opponent discards, we're going to put a quest counter or Nile Stone. At the beginning of each upkeep, if that player has no cards in their hand, and if this card has 2 or more counters on it, we're going to make that player lose 5 life. Just some nice cards to punish our opponent for discarding and having no cards in their hand. Diabolic Tutor and Dark Petition allow us to search our deck for cards that we need. Dark Petition is a little expensive at $4, but it is insane because if there are 2 or more instances or sorcery cards in our graveyard, we're going to add 3 to our mana pool. So essentially this card only costs 2 mana. From under the floorboards, it's going to allow us to create a bunch of 2/2 zombies. If we end up discarding this card, we can cast it for its madness cost and still get some value out of it. Since this deck helps build our opponent's graveyard, we're going to want some cards that counteract that just in case they're running some graveyard strategies. These 3 cards help with that. When Chosen from Death is on the battlefield, we can pay 2 mana and exile 2 cards from the graveyard. Kind of similarly, Deadeye Tracker could do the same thing, except we're going to exile cards and explore. And Ashiok is great because we're going to mill some cards and exile their entire graveyard. They're also not allowed to search their libraries. Going on to some removal, Go for the Throat, Cast Down, and Doomblade are nice 2 mana options. They're also all at instant speed. Never Return, Hero's Downfall, and Murder are some other 3 mana options. Never and Hero's Downfall have the additional benefit of being able to destroy planeswalkers. Herbor's Intervention could be used to destroy creatures and gain some life, or exile some cards from graveyards. Bioblight is good for token decks, and Murderer's Cut could be casted later in the game for 1 mana. Both Tendrils of Corruption and Defile get better as we have more swamps on the battlefield, allowing us to target even bigger creatures. Smallpox is one of my favorite cards. Each player loses 1 life, discards a card, sacrifices a creature, and then sacrifices a land. And Mire and Misery makes all of our opponents sacrifice a creature or an enchantment. Since we're also being forced to discard some of our own cards, we're going to want some ways of getting creatures back. Wandering Death can return some creatures back to our hand. Call to the Netherworld helps us target black creatures, which is every creature in our deck almost. Also, if we discard it, we can cast it for 0 mana. And Persist is going to allow us to get some creatures back to the battlefield that were in the graveyard. Both Undying Evil and Supernatural Stamina are going to allow us to target creatures that are going to die this turn. And then when they do die this turn, they're actually going to come back stronger. Unearth is going to allow us to bring back a creature with 3 mana or less. Whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under control, Dread Presence is going to allow us either to draw a card and lose a life, or we can deal 2 damage to any target and gain 2 life. Great card to continually get value as long as we're playing more lands. With the amount of discard in our deck, our hands will also get quite small, so this card actually does have its use. If Asylum Visitor is on the battlefield, at the beginning of each player's upkeep if they have no cards in hand, we're going to be able to draw a card and lose a life. We can also cast it for its badness cost. Both Sign in Blood and Read the Bones are a nice way to draw some cards, and Underworld Connection can be enchanted to a land and then we get to pay 1 life and draw a card. Both of these 3 artifacts are going to help us get some extra mana onto the battlefield. Black doesn't have a lot of ramp, but these 3 cards will help facilitate that. Dark Ritual is obviously the best black mana ramp card, definitely add this to your deck. And we're running Swift Foot Boots in hopes that we're going to be able to enchant this to one of those larger creatures. It's going to make it very hard for our opponents to deal with, and they're going to continually be discarding cards. For some lands, Witch's Cottage is going to allow us to put a creature from our graveyard on top of our library. Barrenmoor we can cycle to draw a card. And Bojuka Bog is another way to destroy our opponent's graveyard. The Sanitarium makes it so we can pay some mana and each player discards a card then draws a card. And then we're running 30 swamps on top of that. This deck has a lot of discard and a lot of removal. I try to keep this deck under $50, however there's so many good black cards that you can easily add to this deck to make it even better, but it definitely would push the price up. Let me know down below some other cheap cards you would add it to this deck. Thanks for watching everybody, hope you enjoyed, take care.